jack is a symbol of eternal misfortune. In poker, a pair of jacks is the fourth best hand you can be dealt. A statistically strong hand to be sure. It would be illogical to fold these jacks at the beginning of a runout. And yet, many poker players will still fold this hand anyways. Because even if the jacks are good, there's always a strong chance your opponent has something better.
Am I allowed to fold pocket jacks blind versus blind? Alvin, tell me. No.
This is the curse of the jack, a fate where the unfortunate victim is forever doomed to a status of almost good enough. In video games, the curse has taken a new form, the jack of all trades. This is an archetype that often gets cast aside in favor of the potential of something better. Think Mario in Smash Bros. Or the pea shooter in Plants vs. Zombies. No matter how well-rounded the jack is, there's always something better just around the corner. This simple design archetype is what's led so many games to including the jack in their roster. But Team Fortress 2 is a game that, at first glance, doesn't appear to have a jack of all trades. The majority of the 9 classes have something they greatly excel in, and something they're incredibly weak to, with Heavy being the most obvious example. Get too close and he'll melt you in seconds, but keep your distance or attack from behind, and he folds like an omelet. The focus on strengths and drawbacks that TF2 has makes it hard to pin down a jack of all trades in TF2, as every class seems to be specifically modeled to fulfill one specific role above all else. And if most players were asked to pick the jack, they'd probably say Soldier, due to the versatile nature of his weapons and kit. However, while Soldier is very proficient offensively, his defensive and supportive capabilities leave much to be desired. He's very much an offense-focused character, not a jack of all trades. No, there's only one of the 9 classes who can be played in any role and succeed. A true jack who can be used offensively, defensively, and supportively, all while benefiting the team and leading them to victory. This class is the Pyro, and on this episode of Overanalysis, we're going to break down every facet of Pyro's design, weapons, and abilities to figure out what makes them so addictive to play as, and so infuriating to fight against. A jack of all trades, by definition, must succeed at all the major roles of a given game to a significant degree. Versatile is the name of the game here. In Team Fortress 2, these roles are neatly separated into 3 categories, visible from the moment you first select a class. In order for Pyro to truly be a jack, they must succeed at offense, defense, and support. Luckily, Pyro has a set of mechanics, weapons, and skills that allow him to do incredibly well at all 3 of these roles. The only limitation is the player pulling the strings behind the mask. Let's start with offense. A stock Pyro is packing 3 weapons that can all be used as strictly offensive tools, meant to tear down opponents at alarming speeds. Starting with the least effective of these weapons, the Fire Axe is Pyro's stock melee. While many stock melees are borderline useless for their class, Spy and Engineer excluded, Pyro's Fire Axe can actually have a small amount of utility as a tool to finish off enemies that are on low health. Since Pyro already works in close range by nature, he'll often be close enough to targets to get a hit off with his melee weapon, something other classes couldn't accomplish without taking a great risk. This isn't a situation that will occur too often, but it's still a use case the Fire Axe has that gives it an important role in Pyro's kit. At least, that's how it was likely intended to be. Unfortunately, like most other stock melees, this niche role would get majorly outclassed by many of the unlockable weapons that could be placed in the same slot. These other weapons offer the Pyro much more utility and versatility in many more situations, but we'll discuss that later. I need to get like 1 Fire Axe kill. Do you think I can do it? I tried. From a visual design perspective, the use of a Fire Axe as Pyro's melee weapon of choice is intriguing. In real life, firefighters use fire axes to break down obstacles in order to save people or reach safety. This reality would suggest that the axe might be a more supportive tool, able to protect the Pyro and allow him and his team to escape danger, somehow. However, in TF2, the Pyro doesn't use the Fire Axe for this at all. In fact, he uses it entirely offensively. Though this might seem like a contradiction in the design, it's important to remember that the Fire Axe is used supportively in real life by firefighters. Since Pyro is in fact the opposite of a firefighter, it actually makes a lot of sense that he would use a Fire Axe opposite to how a firefighter would, as an offensive tool meant to break helmets and sever limbs. Next up is the shotgun. Pyro's secondary weapon, which unfortunately also manages to make the already niche fire axe even more redundant. The shotgun's main use is for finishing off low health targets using burst damage, same as the fire axe. But while the fire axe does 65 damage on a hit at incredibly close range, the shotgun offers a much more versatile spread of damage at mid to short range, making it much more widely applicable in a variety of different situations. It also does 90 damage at max ramp up, eclipsing the 65 damage of the fire axe. Basically, the shotgun makes the already niche fire axe almost entirely useless, even without the existence of unlockable weapons. What a sad state. Disregarding the shotgun's redundancy, it still works incredibly well as a close-range damage dealer. This is especially true in matchups where the slow damage of Pyro's primary simply isn't enough, such as in fights with other Pyros, for instance. Pyro's suit offers a natural resistance to fire-based attacks, so in matchups against an opposing Pyro, having a shotgun can offer a decisive advantage to make the previously even fight incredibly one-sided. The Pyro's stock melee and secondary weapons are fairly generic, all things considered, but that's by design. You see, the Pyro's other weapons are intentionally uninteresting, mere appetizers to the main course of Pyro's loadout, his magnum opus, the flamethrower. The flamethrower's design is ingenious, genuinely one of the best designs in the entirety of Team Fortress 2, and maybe gaming in general. Did I just get was that random crits?
Yeah.
This is the central focus that all of Pyro's design revolves around, and we'll be returning to it when discussing each of Pyro's roles in Team Fortress 2. Sticking strictly to offense for now, the flamethrower is a powerhouse at close range. If you played TF2 for longer than a few hours, you've almost certainly died from this maneuver a few times. This is such a good flog. There is a spy.
Well, I learned.
Got him. This technique, nicknamed WM1, is accomplished by simply holding down the left mouse button and walking toward the enemy. It's a simple tactic that's easily counterable, but if the Pyro gets a good grasp on timing, the power from the flamethrower's fire alone is enough to decimate entire teams. It's also incredibly visually disorienting, causing an inherent amount of visual chaos meant to overstimulate opponents.
To add to the Pyro's short-range lethality, we made the flamethrower effects visually noisy, which helps disorient opponents long enough for the flames to finish them off.
The secret is to time the Pyro's attack so that it coordinates with a push from the rest of the team. If the enemy is distracted, and already taking damage, they're likely weak enough that a continuous stream of fire is enough to completely destroy their hold on the match. For first-time players, this is a tactic that will work often enough to offer an early amount of success, allowing for a noob to get hooked on the class. This is an intentional piece of Pyro's design. It's no secret that, for new players especially, Pyro works incredibly well because he simplifies one of the two primary skills that define success in Team Fortress 2, aiming. Because new players don't have to aim, it gives them immediate positive feedback for good positioning alone, which encourages them to keep practicing that aspect of the game. Once they become proficient enough with positioning, they can then transition to aiming with their secondary weapon. These offensive characteristics make the class the easiest jumping off point for new players attempting to learn the workings of TF2. One might say that Pyro, as a class, is actually a better tutorial on his own than the built-in tutorial that TF2 already has. This simplicity, however, is a double-edged sword. The joy a new player feels when they kill 5 people by WM1ing is heavily contrasted by the rage that the opposing team is bound to experience. Unlike many of the other, much flashier offensive maneuvers in TF2, most of Pyro's nuance is invisible from the gameplay. While a Pyro might have put a lot of time, thought, and effort into timing his flank perfectly, all the enemy team sees is a person who doesn't need to aim or think in order to wipe out the entire defense. It's a contrast of positive to negative feedback that's consistent throughout all of Pyro's roles. For the opponent, getting killed by a Pyro often feels disrespectful and unearned, because every player knows that all Pyro had to do was hold 2 buttons on their mouse and keyboard, and that's frankly, kinda lame. Despite the initial effectiveness of the WM1 playstyle, it was deliberately designed with a fatal flaw that will cripple it if it's used too flippantly.
The Pyro is designed to be the best short-range combat class, aimed at encouraging players to adopt an ambush style of play. To achieve this, we made the Pyro vulnerable in the open, which forces players to seek out enclosed areas and doorways.
This means that, as with every other class, Pyro's offensive effectiveness is largely based in how well he utilizes his environment. A Pyro running down an enemy team out in the open will result in them getting mercilessly gunned down. But if that same Pyro uses his cover to flank his opponents, the attack is much more likely to be successful. This inherent weakness to being in open spaces is what balances Pyro, the limiting factor that prevents him from being too good even at short range when he's in his element. Once a player gets a good enough grasp on Pyro's offense, they're given a choice. Either they can continue improving with Pyro, or, more likely, they can use what they've learned to get good at a different class. This is the fate that befalls all Jacks, as they continue to be viewed as almost good enough in every area they do well in, but not good enough to be committed to long term. Once the initial hit of dopamine from Pyro's first few hours begins to wear off, it can start to seem like there's nothing else for Pyro to learn. New players are bound to start looking to greener pastures to get their offensive fix. However, there's always more to learn with Pyro, and players who stick with him will eventually evolve him from a simple WM1 machine to a diverse force able to excel at both offense and defense. Air Blast is an integral part of Pyro's modern identity, a hallmark of a good Pyro's gameplay that allows him to contribute to the team's defense incredibly well. However, despite how integral this mechanic is, it actually wasn't in the game when TF2 first released. It's strange to think of a world where Pyro isn't able to reflect projectiles, but this is what players had to experience prior to the change. Before Air Blast was added, it could be argued that Pyro was almost entirely an offensive class. He wasn't able to defend his team, and his supportive capabilities really only extended to spy checking, something we'll discuss in detail later. Pyro was actually much more of a one-trick pony, being a hardcore flanker meant to sneak around corners and ambush enemies. Valve identified this as a problem with Pyro's design. They had deliberately given him a weakness to mid to long range combat, but it had become too punishing for him to deal with. He was a character designed as an offensive specialist, but in doing so, Valve hadn't given Pyro any major way to defend himself against the many classes who could use mid-range combat as their primary form of damage dealing. The challenge the developers had was to find a way to allow Pyro to defend himself in the mid-range while maintaining Pyro as a primarily short-range damage dealer. Somehow, the TF2 devs managed to find a way to remedy this problem by adding one simple mechanic to Pyro's kit: Air Blast. When Air Blast was added, it finally gave Pyro the capabilities necessary to play a significant defensive role in Team Fortress 2. But to explain how Pyro's Air Blast assists him defensively, we need to go a little deeper into the game design concept of commitment. You see, in a well-designed game, developers will often incline the players to do more difficult tasks in order to achieve a desired reward faster, or with more success. This is the classic balancing conundrum of risk versus reward, risk being the chance of failure, and reward being what you get if the action is successful. This problem has a very simple rule. The higher the risk of failure, the greater the reward should be. When a player engages with risk to get a reward, it's called making a commitment. Getting the player to commit to actions in a video game is the most nuanced and challenging task of game design. The risk must be perfectly balanced with the reward, allowing for an adequate amount of challenge so that the reward feels satisfying. There's also a third part of the equation that often doesn't get discussed: the balance of punishment. If a player takes a risk on an action and fails it, they must be punished an adequate amount for failing, proportional to the risk and reward of the action. This triangle of balance is the struggle that developers must contend with whenever a new mechanic or weapon is added to a game. In 2008, when Air Blast was added to Team Fortress 2, it had to strike the sweet spot in the triangle of balance. It needed to give Pyro an adequate amount of risk to ensure it's not too easy to pull off, a good reward for performing it successfully, and an appropriate punishment for failure. Implementing this into a game during development would already be difficult enough, but Valve had to find a way to implement Air Blast into a game that already had an active player base and a developing meta. Designing a tool that wouldn't be too overpowered, yet still useful, was a test of ingenuity for the TF2 devs, and one they would pass with flying colors. Air Blast, like most other mechanics in TF2, is a tool that's easy to learn, yet difficult to master. By simply right-clicking while the flamethrower is out, the Pyro releases a wall of compressed air strong enough to knock back any projectile that's in its range. If the reflected projectile manages to hit someone, it does mini-crit damage to them. The defensive implications of this are massive, allowing for Pyro to protect his team against two of the most dominant offensive threats in the game, Soldier and Demoman. Both of these classes do massive area of effect damage, and can wipe out entire teams if they're good enough. Before Pyro had Air Blast, they were able to attack him at mid-range with little to no counterplay, as Pyro would have to switch to his shotgun to even have a chance at dealing with them. Now both of the explosive classes would have to respect Pyro much more, as he could fire back at them and kill them almost instantly if they were too careless with their explosives. This is hugely important for Pyro as a class, as it gave him an alternative role as a frontline defender. He can stand next to his team and reflect back incoming projectiles that would hinder his team's progress, as well as using the force of the air blast to push the classes themselves off of the point. That's right, air blast doesn't just affect projectiles. It also allows Pyro to manipulate the positions of the attacking team with the simple click of a mouse. This alone offers Pyro numerous strategies that he didn't have before, both offensively and defensively. He can push classes against walls for easy shotgun or melee damage, reflect projectiles from engineer sentries, or push players off the map and watch their ragdoll fly down the cliff. These were all capabilities that offered major reward for players who get better at Pyro's air blast. However, this reward didn't come without risk. The speed projectiles fly at in TF2 meant that Pyro had to be constantly ready to air blast at all times, sometimes even air blasting preemptively if the attack was too fast to react to normally. Weapons like the direct hit fire projectiles that are often too fast for the average human to respond to, putting Pyro in a very risky position if he wants to use his air blast appropriately. And if he fails to hit the short window of time required to reflect the projectile, he's met with a direct shot from the projectile he's forced to reflect. An appropriate punishment for missing a relatively easy input. The air blast, from a design perspective, is one of TF2's most solid mechanics, turning Pyro from a one-note offensive specialist to a versatile class who can play a role on offense and defense equally as effectively. But the air blast wasn't just a defensive tool. It also allowed the Pyro to drop the psychopathic mask he'd been hiding behind, and enter his true form, the Pyro. On May 21, 2009, Pyro's air blast was buffed to allow him to extinguish teammates who were on fire. This was a change that cemented Pyro as a class that could also play a supportive role on his team, in addition to the offensive and defensive capabilities Pyro already had. This support style of Pyro is often called Pyro, and is an entire subversion of what the class represents in the eyes of many people. You see, in many parts of the TF2 community, Pyro is regarded as the most hated class in the entire game. Many players find him annoying, frustrating to fight against, and generally boring to play. Pyro players are frequently stereotyped as brain-dead, mindless, and toxic, and his arsenal of unlocks contain many of the most hated weapons in the entire game, a fact we will once again get to later. The unfortunate reality is that Pyro's lack of definite personality, as well as his pick-up-and-play nature, have turned him into an object of mockery and ridicule in the eyes of the general community. This negative perception hasn't been helped by how he managed to beat the Meat vs. Match vote several years ago, receiving a much-needed update at the expense of the Heavy, a much more well-liked class in the eyes of the community. Long story short, people hate Pyro. Luckily, he's been given the tools to overcome this negative perception, turning from the maligned Pyro into the appreciated Pybro. Pybro is a supportive inclined take on the base Pyro class. Though it's often characterized by a specific set of unlocks, this subclass is based much more around a specific mentality that you have to have in order to be a more supportive Pyro. Rather than strictly attacking the enemy or defending the team, the Pybro is meant to bolster the abilities of his team. The main way he does this is by protecting them from threats they would otherwise have to take care of themselves. For instance, if a teammate is set on fire and would like to put it out, normally they'd have to go find a health pack or a medic in order to heal themselves. However, if there's a Pybro on the team, they no longer have to worry about halting their attack to go find health. The Pybro can simply extinguish them, and allow them to continue fighting the good fight. That said, the Pybro is probably most known for his relationship with enemy spies. That is to say, he completely annihilates them. Though I've been admittedly ignoring it until now, Pyro's best supportive skill is spy checking, or the act of constantly searching for cloaked enemy spies. Because Pyro doesn't have to aim as much as other classes do, he can spread his fire rapidly around corners and hidey holes in order to catch spies and exterminate them. His ability to do this is what makes him such a significant supportive force. The mere existence of a Pyro makes a spy's job exponentially harder. It forces the spy to have to choose between taking out the Pyro first and then going for his second target, or going for the second target first and attempting to get away before he can be killed. In this way, a Pybro's existence alone is a supportive tool, acting as a deterrent for flankers and spies. However, a Pybro is nothing without his equipment, which leads us neatly into the next section. While Pyro's base design and stock weapons already make him an excellent jack of all trades, the versatility of the class is truly exemplified through Pyro's unlockable weapons. Pyro, with no exaggeration, has the most varied spread of unlocks between all 9 classes. While some classes like Demoman have weapons that switch their gameplay style entirely, and other classes like Heavy have unlocks that don't change their gameplay significantly at all, the Pyro has an incredibly wide spectrum of what each of his weapons allow him to do. There's such a variety, in fact, that I think each of them deserves at least a little bit of the spotlight in this over-analysis of Pyro's design. So, in an effort to live up to this series' name, I would like to discuss every single unlockable weapon Pyro can equip. In the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, I'll be giving each weapon a ranking out of 5 for how much the weapon excels in either offense, defense, or support. This ranking will help communicate exactly what role each weapon helps Pyro excel at the most, as each of them help Pyro become less of a jack-of-all-trades and instead be more of a specialist. Starting with the flamethrowers, the general trend with all 4 of the unlocks is that they all increase Pyro's efficiency as an offensive class. It seems that the philosophy with designing the flamethrowers was to give Pyro different ways of going about flanking enemies. That said, some of them do heavily assist with Pyro's other roles, so it's still worth discussing how each of them affect TF2's jack-of-all-trades. Starting off, we have the backburner. This weapon is obviously intended to incline the Pyro toward a more offensively oriented role. Its focus on critical hits from behind incentivizes Pyro to be a full-on flanker, not operating in any other role. Equipping this weapon nerfs the amount of air blast the Pyro can perform, which means that using the backburner defensively is less than optimal. The Degreaser is the offensive flamethrower. Its increased switching speed allows for Pyro to spec into a more combo-oriented class. By combining attacks from multiple weapons quickly, Pyro can do insane amounts of single-target damage in an incredibly short time. The nerfs that the Degreaser offers toward Air Blast and especially Afterburn heavily nerf the Pyro's defensive and supportive capabilities, shifting Pyro's focus much more toward an offensively orientated juggernaut. Moving on, the infamous Phlogistinator is probably the biggest instance of power creep in TF2. When the game came out, Pyro didn't have Air Blast at all. When the Flog was released, Pyro had Air Blast for so long that it had become indispensable. So now, Pyro without Air Blast needed a meter-based super attack to compensate for how underpowered he is without Air Blast. This aforementioned lack of Air Blast makes Pyro almost useless defensively and supportively. However, this weapon does do incredibly well at what it's intended to do, which is flank large groups of enemies and set them on fire. Unfortunately, the process required to fill up the Flog's meter reinforces a very campy, annoying playstyle that isn't fun to play against for most players. The Dragon's Fury is something of an experimental weapon. In many ways, it's the opposite of the Phlogistinator. While the Flog focused on large, slow-paced, multi-target damage, the Dragon's Fury excels at quick, focused, single-target damage. While this would seem like a weapon that's meant to be used for offense exclusively, similar to the Degreaser, it has an important distinction that makes it much more versatile. The Dragon's Fury does triple the damage to burning players. This one stat makes this flamethrower much more usable as a supportive weapon, since you can use it to combo attacks with other Pyros in their primaries. This gives it a unique trait the other flamethrowers don't have, allowing it more utility as a supportive tool. However, its heavily nerfed Air Blast does detract from its use defensively. Pyro's secondary unlocks are the most important part of what allow him to specialize into certain roles. Each of the different categories give different benefits to Pyro that make him even more versatile than he already was with his base kit. The Flare Gun is one of the best secondaries in Team Fortress 2, one of the most intuitive and well-designed weapons the game has to offer. Its design is an overall buff to Pyro's offensive and supportive capabilities, without having to sacrifice any defensive output at all. Starting with the offensive part, the Flare Gun is a weapon that fires a small flaming projectile that does 30 damage on hit. However, if the opponent is on fire, then the flare does a critical hit, resulting in 90 total damage done to the target. This one small change opens up a massive amount of options for Pyro's single target damage output. If the flare target's burst damage is combined with fire from the flamethrower, it can do enough damage to kill light classes incredibly quickly. This combo, often referred to as a flare punch, makes Pyro an even more deadly close-range damage dealer. On top of that, the range the flare gun provides means that it's possible for him to use it as a supportive weapon. The flare gun is incredibly good at pestering snipers at long range, as the afterburn makes it more difficult for snipers to effectively aim and puts them in danger of getting flare punched if they stay uncovered for too long. The ranged element means that the Pyro has a much wider range of influence than he did previously, which is incredibly useful when Pyro is focused on supporting his team. All in all, the flare gun is one of the most universally acclaimed secondaries in all of TF2, and gives the Pyro a massive buff in both his offensive output and his supportive capabilities. The detonator is much more notable for its utility than anything else, as it gives the Pyro the ability to blast jump using the new explosive flares. This means that Pyro can, with a lot of practice, quickly approach classes that were difficult for him to get to before. The ability to blast jump can also heavily improve Pyro's ability to ambush other enemies, as he can now jump onto them from places he couldn't get to before. The drawback to this is that the detonator has lower base damage and only does a mini crit on burning players as opposed to the full critical hit the OG flare gun does. The lower overall damage this flare gun does compared to the original makes it slightly worse offensively, as it can't combo light classes nearly as effectively without adding support from other weapons. However, I do think this weapon is just as good supportively as the original flare gun, since the damage is counterbalanced by its new explosive capabilities, allowing the Pyro to do long-range burst damage to multiple enemies at once. This can be useful on the points of Payload or King of the Hill maps, where large clusters of enemies is a fairly common occurrence. Plus, the lessened damage doesn't significantly hinder the detonator's ability to target snipers. In fact, the knockback caused by the detonator will end up hindering their aim even more than before. The reserve shooter is an alternative to the shotgun that allows Pyro to combine his air blast with a shotgun pellet in order to do mini crits. Since this got nerfed to the ground with Jungle Inferno, it essentially serves as a less accurate and overall worse flare gun. Not particularly useful unless the Pyro can't manage to hit his flares or keeps getting attacked by blast jumping soldiers and demomen. But if that's a serious problem, air blast is an even better deterrent against blast jumping than shooting someone is, making this weapon completely redundant. The Man Melter is arguably Pyro's best supportive secondary, as it buffs his ability to extinguish teammates. With this weapon, each extinguished teammate equates to one stored critical hit, which the Man Melter can fire at any time. This means that the Pyro is given an even greater incentive to stay close to his team and protect them from enemy Pyros, as he can use the damage the enemy Pyro does as fuel to further protect this team. This weapon offers a positive feedback loop between helping the team and attacking the enemy, encouraging the Pyro to play more supportively and focus on helping the team. This can also be synergized with the Phlogistinator to allow the Pyro to extinguish his team without air blast. This takes the support of the Man Melter and uses it to channel the Phlog's offensive deadliness. The two main drawbacks to the Man Melter are that it's only effective if the enemy team has a Pyro, which isn't always the case, and that the projectile it fires doesn't feel super consistent to hit. The Scorch Shot is one of the most hated weapons in all of TF2. While the flare gun gives the Pyro situational coverage at long range, the Scorch Shot ramps this up to 11 and rewards the Pyro significantly more for spam firing at the enemy team. Its damage penalty is its only real downside, but it's barely even applicable when the weapon often hits opponents twice anyways, resulting in a mini crit on a single hit. In short, it's a stupid weapon that's kind of OP for how effective it is at pestering enemies at long range. When combined with the Phlog, this is absolutely ridiculous. The Panic Attack is a stock shotgun side grade that's built around quick, decisive kills in exchange for a greater reliance on accuracy and precision. For Pyro, it's essentially a less support-based shotgun, since it's not nearly as good at chip damage in the mid to long range. Other than that, it's probably the least standout weapon in Pyro's entire kit, just a simple shift in the stats that barely changes Pyro's playstyle. The Thermal Thruster may be Pyro's most unique secondary. It gives Pyro massive mobility and the ability to get in and out of situations very easily without much difficulty. This allows him to ambush better, making him a more chaotic offensive threat, but the speed at which the Thermal Thruster takes off makes it a bit predictable and easy to counter. I think the Jetpack's best trait is that it allows for Pyro to quickly switch from different parts of the battlefield, and of course giving him an opportunity to escape danger. The Thermal Thruster is the only secondary Pyro has that, in my opinion, makes the Pyro better in each of the three roles near equally. The ultimate jack-of-all-trades tool for the jack-of-all-trades class. The Gas Passer just sucks. Moving on to the melee weapons, most of these give Pyro a new ability or utility. The general philosophy behind these designs is to make the class better at handling specific situations, such as dealing with spies, or doing even more damage to low health enemies. Starting with that last one, the Extinguisher is my personal favorite of Pyro's melee weapons. It gives Pyro one final flashy ender to his aforementioned Combo Pyro subclass. On top of that, the speedy getaway that a successful kill gets is similar to that of the Big Earner, in that it allows Pyro to either escape to safety or go back in and kill more targets. This makes Pyro an excellent offensive threat, both on and off the point, and also makes him more unpredictable as a force. This is all on the condition, though, that the Pyro is good enough to use the Extinguisher effectively. If not, it provides no benefit to the Pyro, something that can't be said for several of Pyro's other melee options. This includes the Homewrecker. The Homewrecker is the Pybro's best friend. It allows him to destroy the sappers of enemy spies. This vital ability allows Pyro to protect the engineer's buildings completely from said spies, which frees the engineer up to be more mobile and independent. It's a simple weapon in its execution, and is an incredible help to any defense that's reliant on the engineer's sentries to stay alive by further complicating an enemy spy's job. The ultimate support tool for Pyros to cling to as they fall asleep at night. The Power Jack is an incredibly punishing weapon to use. The 25% damage vulnerability is very difficult to work around for even a novice, as the weapon essentially forces Pyro to play incredibly conservatively in order to survive. Basically, this weapon is a massive skill check, and if you don't pass, you will experience pain. The good news is that, in the event that you can put up with the punishing downsides, the upsides are tremendous. A massive 15% movement buff allows Pyro to have an even greater effectiveness at basically everything, since he can do everything much faster when he has the Power Jack out. On top of that, there's a bonus benefit of 25 health on kill, but that's basically not an upside, as swinging a melee weapon for combat while having a 25% damage vulnerability is ridiculously detrimental to one's own health. All in all, the Power Jack is a great all-around pick, as the speed boost is always helpful. However, it's specifically helpful when playing defensively or supportively, as you likely won't be taking as much damage in those roles, assuming you're playing them well. The Back Scratcher is very situational. Its main benefit is that it allows the Pyro to get more health from health packs, which in turn makes the Pyro less dependent on his team. This, combined with the downside of 75% less health gained from mediguns and dispensers, means that the Pyro is basically pigeonholed into being an ultra-offensive class above anything else. This makes it a weapon that lacks greatly in offensive versatility, while also lacking the flashiness of something like the Extinguisher. For a lone wolf Pyro who never wants to interact with his team, this is the ideal choice. Otherwise, this is probably something most should stay far away from. Speaking of which, the Sharpened Volcano Fragment is borderline cosmetic when equipped in the melee slot, offering 25% less damage in exchange for setting the target on fire, something most of Pyro's weapons already do without having to get up in the enemy's face. Basically, what? The third degree is a relatively mediocre weapon in the grand scheme of things, but its main benefit is an incredibly unique one that can be useful in several situations. It allows Pyro to hit not just a medic, but also to transfer the damage done to the medic to their heal target. This can be used to drop both a medic and their patient at once, in very crucial, yet specific situations. These situations are not numerous. They include if the Pyro hits a random critical hit, or if he has guaranteed critical hits through some outside source like a Kritzkrieg, and that's about it for situations that will happen more than once every 10 games. The Neon Annihilator is essentially the third degree, except useful in even less situations. It crits if the enemy is wet, which means that it's very, very, very situational. Not worth using if playing seriously. And I've heard through the grapevine that it's not even fun, if you could believe it. But hey, you didn't hear it from me. Last, but almost least, is the Hot Hand. This weapon, as funny as it is conceptually, is once again an incredibly niche weapon that's barely helpful in most situations. It does less damage in exchange for giving a speed boost on hit. This is occasionally helpful in using an enemy to get a speed boost away from danger, but other than that, this is seldom ever useful. Something of an anticlimactic ending to this lightning round of weapon reviews. Pyro's weapons, and everything else about him, are a reflection of who he is, the eternal middle child of Team Fortress 2. Every unlock, every design choice, every facet of Pyro's design is positioned so he's able to be the ultimate jack of all trades. He has the ability to defend against spies, invalidate explosive classes, flank and kill entire teams, all inside a single kit. While other classes are able to do multiple jobs, such as Soldier supporting through his banners, or Engineer playing offense with the Gunslinger, the Pyro is the only class who's able to perform competently at basically any situation TF2 can throw at him. He excels at short-range combat, has shotguns for the mid-range, and can use flare guns to pester at long ranges. He can defend his team on the point in the front line, or hang back to support the engineers and medics. There's really nothing he can't do at least adequately. However, by the same token, there's very little that Pyro does exceptionally. In the short range, he's outclassed by Scout, in the mid-range, Demo has him beat, and obviously Sniper has his fingers on the pulse of every sightline in every map ever. The through-and-through specialists who were designed to do a specific job will always do that job better than Pyro ever could with his half-hearted efforts, because those are the jobs that make those classes special. Pyro's specialty is that he has none. He's not better than the other classes at any one thing, but he's the only class who's able to do everything. the ultimate jack of all trades, the middle child of Team Fortress 2. Thank you for watching this overanalysis.